Frostbite doesn't care about royal bloodlines. When the reigning alpha of the Northern Territories fell to a brutal midnight coup, his 5-year-old heir became a hunted liability. Every allied pack slammed their doors shut. It took the lowest-ranking outcast, an Omega with nothing to lose, to brave the avalanche warnings. The temperature in the Blackwood Ridge had plummeted to 30 below zero, a lethal chill that could freeze the breath in a man's lungs. In the grand, cedar-panelled foyer of the Sterling Pack's estate, the warmth of a roaring hearth mocked the cruelty unfolding on the front porch. Elara stood in the shadows of the kitchen hallway, a damp dish towel still clutched in her raw, overworked hands. Through the frosted glass of the mahogany front doors, she could see the silhouettes of power and cowardice. David Sterling, the alpha of the Crescent Valley, stood with his arms crossed over his thick cashmere sweater. At his feet, shivering uncontrollably in the knee-deep snow, was a 5-year-old boy. The child was dressed in shredded, blood-soaked pajamas, his bare feet sinking into the icy powder. This was Leo Harrington, the sole surviving son of Alpha King Alistair Harrington. Just 48 hours ago, Alistair had been the undisputed ruler of the Northern Territories. Now, rumours whispered that Alistair had been slaughtered by his own trusted commander, Silas Montgomery, in a coordinated siege that left the royal estate in ashes. "Take him away," David Sterling's voice muffled through the heavy oak door, laced with a cowardly tremor. "I won't bring Silas Montgomery's wrath down on my people. The Harrington reign is over." "Silas said to leave him in the elements," a gruff voice replied. One of Silas's rogue mercenaries, a massive brute named Cale. "Let the winter claim the pup. If you take him in, Sterling, Silas burns this valley to the bedrock." Elara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as David Sterling took a step back, closed his heavy oak doors, and threw the deadbolt. The click echoed through the silent, opulent house like a gunshot. David walked past the kitchen without a second glance, retiring to his study to pour a glass of bourbon. He had just sentenced a 5-year-old child to freeze to death to save his own skin. It wasn't just David. The whispers in the kitchen that morning had confirmed the horrific truth. The boy had been dumped at the borders of the Redwood Pack, the Clearwater Clan, and the Ironclad Brotherhood. Every single pack, leaders who had once bowed and toasted to King Alistair, had turned a blind eye. The Alpha King's pup was too dangerous to save. Elara looked down at her hands. As an Omega, she was the lowest of the low in the pack hierarchy. Years ago, she had been a respected tracker, but she had publicly defied David's corrupt taxation of the lower-tier wolves. Her punishment was stripping her of her rank, forcing her into a life of indentured servitude, washing dishes and scrubbing floors. She had no power, no voice, and barely any rights. But as she looked out the window and saw the mercenaries laughing, climbing into their armoured SUV, and driving away, leaving the tiny bleeding boy curled in a snowbank, something inside Elara snapped. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about Silas Montgomery's silver-tipped bullets or David Sterling's wrath. She only saw a child dying in the dark. Moving with silent, practiced efficiency, Elara raided the pantry. She shoved high-calorie protein bars, a heavy thermos of boiling water, and a stolen first aid kit into a canvas rucksack. She grabbed her heavy canvas parka, lined with synthetic fleece, and a pair of worn but sturdy snow boots. Slipping out through the cellar doors, the wind hit Elara like a physical blow. The storm was upgrading to a blizzard, the snow falling in thick, blinding sheets. She waded through the drifts toward the edge of the property line. Leo was unconscious when she reached him. His small body was curled tightly into a fetal position, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. When Elara turned him over, she gasped. A deep, jagged laceration tore across his ribs, the unmistakable mark of a silver blade, silver-poisoned werewolf blood, suppressing their natural healing abilities. It was the only reason the cold was killing him so quickly. Hey, little wolf, look at me," Elara whispered, her voice immediately snatched away by the howling wind. She stripped off her parka and wrapped the massive coat around the tiny boy, lifting him into her arms. He weighed almost nothing, his skin frighteningly cold to the touch. "Where?" "My dad," Leo murmured, his eyelids fluttering, his voice barely a rasp. "We're going to find him," Elara lied, her throat tight with unshed tears. She secured him against her chest, tying the sleeves of the parka tightly around her own waist to keep him anchored. "But first, we have to walk." She couldn't stay in the valley. By morning, David would notice she was gone and put the pieces together. Silas's men would return to confirm the boy's death. There was only one place to go: the Blackwood Ridge. It was a treacherous, unmapped mountain pass, spanning 50 miles of jagged peaks and frozen ravines. Beyond it lay the Canadian border and a neutral territory where Silas's jurisdiction ended. It was considered suicide to cross it in a blizzard. Elara tightened the straps of her rucksack, bowed her head against the blinding gale, and took her first step into the white abyss. By the afternoon of the second day, the world had shrunk to nothing but the sound of crunching snow, the screaming wind, and the agonizing burn in Elara's thighs. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she knew that stopping meant death. The temperature hovered around -20. Frost clung to Elara's eyelashes, partially blinding her. Beneath her layers, Leo was completely silent, his breathing shallow and erratic. The silver infection was spreading, fighting against the boy's dormant alpha genetics. "Tell me a story," Leo had asked hours ago, his voice weak. Elara had spent the miles recounting ancient legends of the first wolves, anything to keep his mind tethered to the waking world. But now, he was slipping. She paused under the slight overhang of a frozen waterfall, pulling the thermos from her bag with trembling, numb fingers. She poured a meager amount of lukewarm water into the cap and pressed it to Leo's chapped lips. "Drink, Leo, please," she begged. He managed a small swallow before coughing, a wet, rattling sound that terrified her. Suddenly the wind shifted. A scent hit Elara's nose, cutting through the sterile smell of pine and ice. Wet fur, gun oil, wolves. She wasn't alone. Silas's trackers hadn't waited for the storm to break. They were hunting them. Elara scrambled up a steep embankment, her boots slipping on the black ice beneath the powder. She dragged herself and the boy into a narrow crevice between two massive granite boulders, holding her breath. Below, 3 figures emerged from the whiteout. They were in their human forms, clad in tactical winter gear, carrying high-powered rifles. Shifting into wolf form would mean burning too many calories in this extreme cold, and humans were better at navigating the treacherous icy cliffs. The leader of the trio pulled down his thermal mask, and Elara's blood ran colder than the snow beneath her. It was Arthur, her older brother. Arthur had always been ambitious, desperate to climb the pack ranks. When Elara had been demoted, he had turned his back on her, claiming her rebellion was a stain on their family name. Seeing him now, wearing the dark grey insignia of Silas Montgomery's new regime, made Elara nauseous. "The tracks end here," one of the mercenaries shouted over the wind, pointing to the scuffed snow at the base of the embankment. Arthur stared intently at the slope. His eyes, the same pale amber as Elara's, narrowed. He knew her. He knew how she thought, how she moved. He began to climb the embankment. "Elara," Arthur called out, his voice carrying a deceptive, calm authority. "I know you're up there. The scent is faint, but it's yours. And the blood. That's the boy." Elara pressed her back against the freezing granite, pulling Leo tighter against her chest. She drew a standard-issue flare gun from her rucksack, a piece of emergency gear she had stolen from David Sterling's garage. It only had one shot. "Listen to me, Elara," Arthur continued, stopping just 10 feet below her hiding spot. Silas has taken the capital. Alistair is gone. It's a new world now. Don't throw your life away for a dead king's ghost. Hand over the pup. I've spoken to Silas myself. If you give him the boy, your Omega status will be revoked. You can be a respected member of the Vanguard. You can have a warm bed, food, respect. He's a child, Arthur, Elara screamed back, unable to stay silent. Her voice cracked raw from the cold. He's 5 years old. You're hunting a child for a tyrant. Arthur sighed, a plume of white breath escaping his lips. He's not a child. He's a political symbol. As long as he breathes, the loyalists will rally. He is a threat to the peace. Put him down, Elara. Don't make me kill my own sister. You died to me the day you let them put me in chains, Elara spat. Arthur signaled the two mercenaries below. They raised their rifles, the laser sights cutting through the falling snow. Last chance, Elara. Elara looked at the heavy, unstable snowpack resting on the sheer cliff face directly above Arthur and his men. The blizzard had deposited tons of heavy, wet snow on a fragile layer of ice. She didn't aim the flare gun at her brother. She aimed it 40 feet straight up. Go to hell, she whispered, and pulled the trigger. The flare shot upward with a loud, shrieking hiss, a blinding ball of red magnesium. It struck the cliff face with a violent thud, burying itself deep into the snowpack before igniting with explosive heat. Avalanche! One of the mercenaries screamed, but it was too late. The deafening crack echoed like thunder. A massive slab of white detached from the mountain. Elara threw herself flat into the deepest part of the rock crevice, curling her entire body over Leo to shield him. The world turned into a roaring, violent white blur. The ground shook so violently, Elara thought the mountain itself was tearing apart. Millions of pounds of snow, ice, and rock cascaded down the slope, sweeping right over their shallow cave and crashing into the valley below. When the roar finally subsided, an eerie, suffocating silence fell over the ridge. Elara coughed, spitting out snow, and forced her way out of the drift that had partially buried them. She peered over the ledge. The trail below was gone, replaced by a massive, chaotic debris field of ice. There was no sign of Arthur or the mercenaries. She had survived. But the victory was hollow. The avalanche had completely blocked the path back and destroyed the only known trail forward. They were forced off route, deeper into the uncharted, lethal heart of the Blackwood Ridge. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping to a suicidal degree. Worse, Leo had stopped shivering. Any survivalist knew that when the shivering stopped, severe hypothermia was setting in. The body had given up trying to warm itself. Elara spotted a small, dark opening in the rock face a few 100 yards away. A narrow ice cave. She dragged herself toward it, her vision tunneling, black spots dancing at the edges of her sight. She stumbled inside. It was barely large enough for the two of them, but it blocked the wind. She set Leo down. His breathing was so shallow she had to put her ear to his mouth to ensure he was still alive. His skin was like marble. The silver infection from his wound was radiating a sickening, dark purple hue across his ribs. No, don't leave me, Leo," Elara sobbed, her tears instantly freezing on her cheeks. She knew what she had to do. Medical textbooks called it extreme rewarming. She stripped off her wet outer coat, her soaked sweater, and her damp thermal shirt until she was bare to the freezing air. She undressed Leo, tossing aside his bloody, frozen pajamas. Pulling the heavy wool blankets from her bag, she wrapped them both tightly together inside the makeshift cocoon, pressing her bare skin directly against his. She curled around him, using every ounce of her own body heat to fight the ice creeping into his veins. "I'm here," Elara whispered into the darkness, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached. She held the Alpha King's son tightly against her chest, offering her own life force to keep his heart beating. "I'm right here. I won't let them win." As the darkness of the cave closed in and the storm raged outside, Elara closed her eyes, praying to the moon goddess for a miracle, unaware that their disappearance had just triggered a chain of events that would bring the entire werewolf kingdom to its knees. The sun didn't truly rise the next morning. It merely diluted the violent darkness into a bleak, bruising grey. Elara woke to the agonizing sensation of 1,000 glass shards grinding inside her veins. It was the painful throb of blood, desperately trying to return to frostbitten extremities. She opened her crusty, ice-sealed eyes. The interior of the narrow cave was deadly silent. For a terrifying second, she thought she had failed. But then she felt it, a faint, rhythmic thumping against her bare collarbone. Leo was alive. Her extreme rewarming tactic had worked, using her own core temperature to pull him back from the brink of severe hypothermia. However, the silver poison was still ravaging his small system. The dark purple veins spiderwebbing across his ribs had spread to his neck. He was burning up with a lethal fever. "Hold on, Leo," Elara rasped, her voice sounding like crushed gravel. "Just a little longer." Dressing herself with agonizing slowness, her fingers clumsy and numb, she wrapped the boy back in the heavy wool blankets. Leaving the cave, Elara found the avalanche had completely altered the landscape, but the storm had finally broken. To the north, the jagged peaks began to level out. They were approaching the edge of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, the rugged, heavily forested borderland between the territories and human-occupied Minnesota. For 12 more hours, Elara dragged her body through the knee-deep drifts. She was operating purely on adrenaline, and the primal, protective instinct of a wolf pushed to the absolute limit. She hallucinated twice, seeing her treacherous brother Arthur standing in the tree line, but it was only the shadows of the pines playing tricks on her deteriorating mind. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, threatening another lethal freeze, Elara stumbled onto a ploughed logging road. She collapsed onto the hard-packed ice, her knees finally giving out. She clutched Leo to her chest, unable to take another step. Headlights cut through the twilight. A heavy-duty Ford F250, outfitted with a massive snowplow and chained tires, ground to a halt just feet from her prone body. A burly human logger named Bill Peterson stepped out, a heavy mag light in his hand. "Sweet Jesus," Bill breathed, rushing over to the woman and the bundled child. He didn't ask questions. He didn't care about pack politics or supernatural boundaries. He just saw a dying woman and a sick child. Bill hauled them into the heated cab of his truck and drove them 30 miles south to the coastal town of Grand Marais. He didn't take them to the human hospital, though. Locals living on the edge of the Blackwood Ridge knew the rumors of the mountain folks who preferred their own doctors. Bill dropped them at the back door of a veterinary clinic owned by Dr. Thomas Arrington. Dr. Arrington wasn't just a veterinarian. He was a disgraced pack physician who ran a clandestine underground triage center for rogues, outcasts, and supernaturals fleeing the violent pack wars. "Bring them in, quick!" Dr. Arrington shouted, throwing open the steel doors of the loading dock. He took one look at Elara's frostbitten face and the unconscious child in her arms, and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Inside the sterile, brightly lit clinic, realism replaced the brutal elements. Arrington stripped Leo down on a stainless steel trauma table. He bypassed standard supernatural healing methods, opting for aggressive human medical intervention. He immediately started an IV of warmed lactated Ringer's solution to combat the dehydration and hypothermia, hooking the boy up to a bear hugger warming blanket. "He's been slashed with weapons-grade silver," Arrington muttered, his hands flying as he prepped a tray of surgical instruments. "The toxicity levels are shutting down his organs. If I don't excise the necrotic tissue and run his blood through a dialysis machine to filter the heavy metals, his heart will stop in an hour." Elara, shivering violently on a secondary cot as a nurse wrapped her in thermal foils, tried to sit up. "Do it, whatever it takes. Save him." Arrington looked at Alara, his eyes catching the faded, branded Omega mark on her collarbone. Then he looked at the boy. He carefully wiped the dirt and dried blood from Leo's face. The doctor froze. "By the goddess," Arrington whispered, his face draining of colour. This is Alistair Harrington's son. The royal heir." "Alistair is dead," Alara said, her voice hollow. "Silas Montgomery took the capital. Every allied pack in the valley refused to take the boy in. They left him in the snow to die." Arrington quickly moved to a secure, encrypted satellite phone on the wall. He began dialing a complex sequence of numbers. "Who are you calling?" Alara demanded, panic spiking in her chest. "If you call Silas—" "I'm not calling Silas," Arrington interrupted, his voice tight with an adrenaline-fueled urgency. "The rumors you heard were planted to cause panic. Silas sieged the capital, yes, but he failed to kill the king. Alistair survived. He's been tearing the northern territories apart for 3 days, looking for his son." Alara's heart stopped. The Alpha King was alive, and he was coming. The surgery took 4 agonizing hours. Alara refused to sleep, sitting in a plastic chair outside the operating room, while an IV drip pumped high-dose antibiotics and fluids into her own battered system. She had lost the tips of her pinky and ring finger on her left hand to frostbite, a permanent physical reminder of the Blackwood Ridge. Just after midnight, the heavy steel doors of the clinic's loading dock didn't just open, they were violently breached. The security alarms blared for a fraction of a second before they were ripped from the walls. A dozen massive men, clad in tactical black armor and carrying military-grade weaponry, flooded the corridor. They were the King's vanguard, the most lethal enforcers in the supernatural world. Behind them walked Alistair Harrington. The Alpha King was a terrifying sight. He stood 6'5", his broad shoulders filling the hallway. He wore a dark, blood-stained trench coat over a shredded Kevlar vest. The left side of his face was heavily bandaged, masking a fresh, brutal wound from the coup, but his remaining eye burned with a violent, electric amber glow. The sheer aura of his presence, the crushing weight of an Alpha King's pheromones, forced the clinic staff to their knees. Alara, too weak to stand, remained in her plastic chair, her chin held high, meeting the King's terrifying gaze. "Where is he?" Alistair's voice was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated the medical instruments on the trays. Dr. Arrington stepped out of the operating room, his scrubs covered in Leo's blood. He immediately dropped his head in a submissive bow. "He is stabilized, my king. The silver has been filtered. He will sleep for days. But his alpha genetics are already repairing the tissue damage. He will live." Alistair pushed past the doctor, stepping into the sterile room. For a long, agonizing moment, the corridor was silent. Then, Alara heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the linoleum floor as the ruthless, untouchable King of the North dropped to his knees beside his son's hospital bed. A muffled, broken sob echoed from the room, the sound of a father who thought his world had ended. When Alistair finally emerged, the murderous rage had vanished from his eye, replaced by a profound, overwhelming intensity. He looked at Dr. Arrington. "Who saved him? Who fought the cold?" "She did, Alpha." Arrington gestured a trembling hand toward Alara in the hall. "She brought him out of the Blackwood Ridge. On foot. Alone. She lost fingers to the frostbite. I had to run her body temperature back up from lethal levels." Alistair slowly approached Alara. She instinctively lowered her gaze slightly, her Omega conditioning screaming at her to submit to the overwhelming power of his presence. But as Alistair drew closer, the clinical smells of iodine and alcohol evaporated. A scent hit his nose, a sharp, intoxicating mixture of crushed pine needles, ozone, and burning wood. Alara, barely conscious, felt the exact same jolt of electricity. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. The scent of dark cedar, smoke, and an undeniable pull of destiny washed over her. It was impossible. She was an outcast, an indentured Omega, but the primal instinct couldn't be denied. The Alpha King had just found his true mate. Alistair stopped inches from her chair. He didn't order her to stand. He didn't command her to speak. Instead, the terrifying, scarred king slowly dropped to one knee before the battered, frost-bitten woman. He gently took her heavily bandaged, scarred left hand in both of his massive, powerful palms. The contact sent a shockwave of heat through Ilara's body, instantly easing the deep ache in her bones. Every allied Alpha shut their doors to him. My own trusted circle left my son in the snow. Alistair's voice was barely a whisper, thick with an emotion that terrified the seasoned warriors behind him. But you carried him through the white hell. Ilara swallowed hard, forcing herself to look into his blazing amber eye. He was a child, my king. I didn't care about the politics. No, Alistair agreed softly, tracing the faded Omega brand on her collarbone with profound reverence. You cared about the soul. Tell me your name. Ilara. Alistair stood, his grip on her hand firm and possessive. The air in the clinic immediately shifted, charged with lethal, unforgiving power. He looked at General Hayes, the leader of his vanguard. General, Alistair commanded, his voice returning to a terrifying, deadly calm. Silas Montgomery's reign of terror ends tonight, but before we take back the capital, we visit the Crescent Valley. General Hayes nodded, checking the magazine of his rifle. Orders regarding David Sterling and the allied Alphas who refused your son, my king. Burn their estates to the bedrock, Alistair ordered, his eye never leaving Ilara's face. The punishment for high treason against the bloodline is death. Let them know the Alpha King has returned, and let them know that an Omega is now the most powerful wolf in the north. Ilara watched as the vanguard dispersed, moving with lethal precision to execute the king's brutal, unwavering justice against those who had closed their doors to a dying boy. As Alistair gently lifted Ilara into his arms, carrying her out of the sterile clinic and into the back of a waiting armored SUV, the winter storm outside had finally passed. The stars above Grand Marais shone with a cold, clear brilliance. For the first time in her life, Ilara didn't feel the biting chill. Wrapped in the thick, heated wool of the Alpha King's coat, the Omega who had braved the deadliest frost found a warmth that would change the course of their world forever. The Northern Territories were never the same. Alistair's vengeance was absolute, reducing the traitorous Pax to ashes, but his rule transformed under Ilara's influence. The Omega who dragged a dying prince through the snow became the new Alpha Queen. She abolished the oppressive hierarchy, proving true strength isn't found in royal bloodlines or titles, but in the fierce, unyielding courage to protect the vulnerable against the coldest nights.